All of us have grown up with stories all around us, so most people take them for granted, like running water and electricity. Only a relatively small group of people ever take the time to learn to fully understand stories, while others, like scientists, have storytelling beaten out of them as part of their training. With climate change, pandemics, and so much more transforming our way of life, it has never been more vital to embrace the power of stories. A nuanced understanding of stories and storytelling is essential to communicate and conserve the lessons learned from scientific research. It is the responsibility of experienced storytellers to nurture this understanding and teach scientists and other academics what they've forgotten. The unique power of stories to transcend time is demonstrated by the tales of the past, especially those of the intricately interconnected societies of the late Bronze Age. 3,200 years ago, the civilizations of the Mediterranean experienced what they could only have described as the end of the world. Marked by the sudden decline of many major powers over the course of only 50 years and the near absence of written records for centuries after, we call this event the Bronze Age Collapse. Between 1200 and 1150 BCE, dozens of cities across the Mediterranean were destroyed, including the city of Troy. Surviving ancient epics like Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, as well as fragments and descriptions of lost epics, give us an insight into the incredible turmoil of the Bronze Age collapse by describing the Trojan War and its aftermath. In the epic cycle, we see the deaths and exiles of the majority of the mythical Greek hero kings. We find ourselves hard-pressed to find a city-state that isn't locked in a succession crisis. We see death, destruction, and hopelessness everywhere we turn. It is no coincidence that Greek mythology ends with the Trojan War. Hesiod even describes the war as one of the final events of the heroic age, which immediately preceded the Iron Age in which Hesiod himself lived, and described as an age of labor and sorrow. While the true cause of the Bronze Age collapse is infinitely complex, what is certain is that the destruction of the Mycenaean and Hittite civilizations, among others, led to several centuries in which written language and trade routes were abandoned, settlements were smaller and poorer, and the single foremost driving motivation for nearly everyone was survival. And yet through all this, the Mycenaean stories of the Trojan War and all the myths that preceded it survived. Stories survived in a time when so little mattered. When conservation of knowledge was no one's priority, stories were conserved. To understand why stories survive, we have to travel to the other side of the world and consider the Agta people of the Philippines. The Agta are a group of hunter-gatherer societies who record their history through oral tradition rather than written records. In a study published in Nature Communications in 2017, a group of researchers asked the elders of one Agta community to tell them some of the stories they might usually tell to children. All of the stories communicated values of the community, including gender equality, cooperation, and social acceptance. This is a very interesting inversion of what we see surrounding the Bronze Age collapse. When civilization collapsed in the Mediterranean, stories were conserved for their value. But in the tens of thousands of years of oral tradition in the Philippines, values have been conserved in stories. At first glance, it seems like a paradox, but think on it for a moment, and a paradigm emerges. Stories are valued because values become stories. The source of the story value paradigm can be found in the structures of narratives around the world, in three simple universal narrative elements: agreement, disagreement, and consequence, where agreement followed by disagreement leads to consequences. These consequences are the reason why stories resonate so deeply. An important mechanism in evolution is natural selection, positing that those who survive will pass on their traits to the next generation. What could be more essential to survival than understanding the consequences of your actions? If you approach a lion, the consequence is being eaten. If you don't cook your food, the consequence is a less filling meal and the risk of disease. The stories the Agta elders tell their children all communicate the benefits, or positive consequences, of their values. For example, their tale of the sun and the moon speaks of a competition between the two to light up the sky. They fought and learned that both were of equal strength, so they decided they would share the responsibility, with the sun lighting the sky during the day and the moon lighting the sky during the night. The story demonstrates that the benefits of cooperation are less work and more time to relax for everyone involved. The epic cycle also communicates consequences. The Iliad demonstrates the consequences of anger when the rage of Achilles leads to nothing but death, including the death of his best friend Patroclus. The Odyssey demonstrates the consequences of hubris when Odysseus boasts to the blinded Cyclops Polyphemus, resulting in Poseidon cursing Odysseus to wander for 10 years. The epic cycle also communicates consequences on a much grander scale, as the tale of how an expedition to destroy the wealthy city of Troy resulted in the collapse of the entire Mycenaean civilization. While societal collapse is far more complex in real life, the story still excellently communicates the consequences of war and greed. The idea of agreement and disagreement leading to consequences applies beyond one-sided storytelling. It also describes what is known as the participation model of science communication. The participation model suggests that two communicators should meet as equals, in agreement that both have something to contribute. They both tell the tales of their experience and understanding, which might lead to some disagreement. And finally, they listen, and consequently both walk away having learned something from the other. To demonstrate this principle, let's consider the story of a scientist and an artist looking at a rainbow. It was by pure chance that the artist and the scientist had taken shelter under the same tree as the storm passed overhead, and it was by pure chance that the sun emerged from the clouds behind them as they crested the small hill. "It's so beautiful," the artist gasped. He wished he could have drawn the wondrous sight then and there, but he'd make do with drawing it from memory later. "It's just sunlight refracting through water droplets," the scientist said dismissively. She saw the rainbow too, but didn't spare it more than a glance. "But look how bright it is. The sky is so dark and the colors are so bright." "Because the clouds have parted behind us and not in front of us, the land is lit up too." The scientist pointed to the suburbs, lit up just as bright as the rainbow. "And that's not beautiful to you?" "Why should it be? Rainbows are always directly opposite to the sun because the sunlight gets split up by the water left in the air by the storm and projected onto the clouds." "So, when you're looking at a rainbow, you're looking at the sun?" "I suppose so. It just can't blind you like it would if you looked straight at it." "So most of the time you can't look at the sun, but because you go blind, and during a storm you can't look at the sun because it's hidden behind the clouds, but then in the moments between you get this one chance, and it's stunning. How couldn't that be beautiful?" As far as the artist was concerned, it was even more beautiful now he understood it. "I guess it is." The scientist trailed off as the clouds behind the rainbow turned red as the sun started to set. Now was the time to appreciate it, in the few moments it lasted. "Hey, why are sunsets red?" the artist wondered. In this story, the scientist and the artist meet as equals, as two people taking shelter from a storm. Once they crest the hill, the pair disagree over their interpretations of the rainbow. When they listen to each other, they both come to appreciate the rainbow more, having constructed a new understanding out of both of their experiences and values. This is what the participation model looks like. Two groups of people listening to each other to their mutual benefit. What happens when we don't tell stories? What are the consequences for spouting facts and figures with no regard for how they fit together? Once again, we can look to history. When people think about the loss of knowledge, they will often conjure images of the burning of the Library of Alexandria. In reality, stories of the burning of the Library of Alexandria were greatly exaggerated. The library remained in use for another 2 centuries after Julius Caesar set fire to the Alexandrian docks, and even if the entire collection had been burned, there were other libraries throughout the Mediterranean with copies of most of the scrolls. The way most knowledge is lost is much more mundane. Over time, languages change, and so for older knowledge to remain accessible, it needs to be translated. Think of the works of Shakespeare written less than 500 years ago in what we now call early modern English. Shakespeare's poems and plays are often translated on the opposite page so students studying them can understand what they're reading. That's after less than 500 years of language drift. The degradation of knowledge due to language drift or language suppression can happen on much shorter timescales too. For example, the suppression of indigenous languages during the colonization of Australia, Canada, and other parts of the world resulted in the destruction of enormous quantities of knowledge that couldn't be translated before its original language died out. Similarly, the preference for the Attic dialect of Greek in scholarship contributed to the loss of the majority of the poetry of Sappho, who wrote in the Aeolic dialect. Despite her historical significance as one of the first poets to position herself as the subject, her work was lost due to its inaccessibility to scholars who only spoke Attic Greek. This is an even more significant issue today, since most of our knowledge is stored on disks and drives that can only be read by computers. Any knowledge that isn't valued enough to be converted to the newest storage format will be lost. That's why we, as storytellers, need to teach researchers, educators, and communicators to understand and value stories, so the stories we all tell are valued. In the epic cycle, Odysseus feigned madness to avoid joining the campaign against Troy, because he didn't want to leave his wife Penelope and their son Telemachus. He understood the consequences of war because he valued the stories of past conflicts. To force Odysseus to join the war, Agamemnon sent a soldier to threaten to kill Telemachus. Agamemnon didn't care for the consequences. He kept the stories of the past to himself and told his men only of the glory and wealth they would receive upon their return. In the end, the consequences came to pass, and the civilizations of the Mediterranean experienced what they could only describe as the end of the world. Today, scientists and science communicators wage war against the problems arising from climate change, inequality, aging populations, and many others using facts and statistics, not caring enough for stories to tell their own. But something that's been unlearned can be relearned. So it's time for storytellers to guide scientists away from the path of Agamemnon, who couldn't understand the value of stories, and onto the path of Odysseus, who understood stories, learned from his mistakes, and found his way home. Scientists are taught not to tell stories very early in their education. Instead, they're taught to communicate with other scientists in forms that have been optimized for maximum information density. These forms allow scientists to efficiently review fields of research so they can spend more of their time conducting their own research. An example of one of these forms is the typical journal article. These start with an abstract, which gives the reader a one-paragraph summary of the whole article, including the motivations behind the research, the methods used, the results obtained, and the writer's interpretation of those results. After the abstract, an introduction gives the reader all the background information they need to understand the article. It also defines the audience. If you don't understand the jargon used in the introduction, you're not the intended audience. Next, the methods used in the research are described, followed by the results obtained using those methods. The second last section of the article is a discussion of the writer's interpretation of their results, and varies between articles more than any other section. Finally, the writer states their conclusions and recommendations for future research directions. This basic structure of introduction, methods, results, discussion, conclusion is common amongst most forms of scientific literature, and leads scientists down the path of information-dense communication that's mind-numbingly boring to everyone who's not already interested in what they're talking about. We've already established the incredible staying power of stories. So what makes them better than academic forms? How are stories structured? If you ask experienced storytellers how they structure their stories, most will give you the same answer. Instinct. Storytellers write what feels right, based on their audience, purpose, and message. That's not going to be good enough for a group of people who have systematically unlearned storytelling. We're going to need a more academic description of stories and their structure. Unfortunately, narrative structure is often misunderstood through an academic lens as a rigid concept with prescribed rules and categories. In Western philosophy, this idea of categorization can be traced back to ancient Greece, where the first book of the Organon, attributed to Aristotle, is simply titled Categories. Categories suggest that all of existence falls into one of 10 classifications: substance, quantity, quality, relation, place, time, situation, condition, action, and passion. Aristotle also sorted the sciences into categories of productive, practical, and theoretical. He even sorted plants into shrubs, herbs, and trees, and animals into their habitats of air, water, and land. None of these classifications are inherently unreasonable considering their time. In fact, they laid the foundation for categorization as a pillar of Western science and philosophy. Therein lies the issue. Categorization is so entrenched in Western philosophy that we have a habit of applying it everywhere, even when it does more harm than good. Narrative structure is one of the places where categorization can be harmful if it's interpreted incorrectly. In reality, as I've already stated, structure is emergent. That is, writers do not force their stories to serve a structure, but rather the structure serves the story, evolving from the values of the storyteller and the audience, as well as the storyteller's purpose for telling the story and any message they're trying to convey. Forcing a story into a structure can weaken its impact on an audience by diminishing elements they value most and prioritizing elements they value least. Rather than a crutch for writing, categories of narrative structure should be considered as tools for analysis. For example, the 3-act structure and Kisho Tenketsu are narrative structures observed in Western and Eastern storytelling respectively. The 3-act structure includes a short first act that introduces the characters and context, which ends with an inciting incident that leads into the second act. The second act comprises the bulk of the story and is all about the conflict experienced by the characters. The third act is the conclusion to the story, resolving and interpreting all conflicts and tying up any loose ends. Kisho Tenketsu literally translates as Introduction, Development, Twist, Conclusion. In this structure, the characters and context are introduced in the first act, Ki. Then in the second act, Sho. Instead of focusing on conflict, the story prioritizes further developing the characters and context. This takes up around half the length of the story. It's only in the third act, Ten, that the conflict is allowed to take center stage. In this act, we witness a twist that surprises the characters and the story's climax. Finally, the fourth act, Ketsu, quickly concludes the story, but doesn't necessarily resolve the conflict or tie up loose ends. It's expected that the audience will interpret their own meaning. The 3-act structure prioritizes the progression and interpretation of the central conflict, while Kisho Tenketsu prioritizes developing characters and deepening the audience's understanding of the story's context. An analysis of the surrounding cultures reveals the values that produce these structures. Western culture has a long tradition of individualism. The conflicts and choices of individuals are celebrated above those of the community. Consider Greek heroes like Heracles, Odysseus, and Achilles. All of these heroes are celebrated in their respective stories for their personal strengths and achievements. By the end of the Odyssey, Odysseus is sailing home alone, having lost his entire crew, most of whom went unnamed, because the audience cared more for Odysseus's personal stakes than the collective stakes of his crew. Conversely, the Southeast Asian cultures where Kisho Tenketsu has been observed typically value collectivism, with the well-being of the community valued above everything else. The story of Hua Mulan and the 16th century Chinese novel Journey to the West are good examples of Eastern stories with collectivist values. Hua Mulan's motivation for joining the army and disguising herself as a man for 10 years are her duty to her family and community. Within the folktale, Hua Mulan is celebrated primarily for her dedication to her family and country, rather than her personal achievements. In Journey to the West, while the kidnap and subsequent rescue of the monk Tripitaka is a common occurrence, it's not the focus of the narrative. Instead, it's used to frame the character development and slowly strengthening friendship of the four main characters. Within this cultural context, the narrative elements that the three-act structure and Kisho Tenketsu prioritize make sense. Now, this is the part where I've run out of academic evidence for my claims and start pulling together an argument based on my own experiences and observations, so feel free to tell me how wrong I am in the comments. The only similarities between all narrative structures are the elements of context, character, conflict, and conclusion. It's a Western idea that narratives should start by introducing character and context, then spend the bulk of the story developing and interpreting the conflict before coming to an unambiguous conclusion. In fact, these four elements can be introduced in any order, be given any priority, and be developed and interpreted by the storyteller to any extent they consider necessary. There are even circular narratives that start with a conclusion, then jump back to character, context, or conflict to show the audience how that conclusion came to be. Forrest Gump is a good example of such a story. The circular structure of Forrest Gump allows the audience to reflect on the protagonist's life and on American history from a modern perspective. Another structure is something known as the gameplay loop, which is often referred to by video game developers. In this structure, character and context are introduced, then the player loops through conflict-character stages, like in the game Portal, or conflict-context stages, like in the earliest games in the Halo franchise, for the bulk of the game until they eventually reach the conclusion. This allows players to solve similar problems many times over without getting bored, because the context is changing and the characters are being developed. The emphasis that academia puts on categorization has stripped many scientists of their instinctive storytelling skills. But now we've categorized a set of narrative elements, we can reintroduce those skills using the same logical and critical lenses that created the problem in the first place. Narratives can be structured as any order and priority of context, character, conflict, and conclusion, justified by the storyteller's audience, purpose, and message. Consider what your audience values most and make that the centerpiece of your story. Then build everything else around that based on what feels right. For example, if you're communicating the life cycle of the sun, your audience might care most about the conflicts that made the sun what it is today. So you could introduce gravity as a character who fights to draw the mass of the sun in, and heat as a character who fights to force it out. You could explain how that conflict leads to the explosive deaths of the largest stars, which enables the creation of younger stars surrounded by planets made of heavier elements like iron and carbon. Finally, you could relate that conclusion to the emergence of life on Earth, and therefore the context of your audience. That's exactly what I did in the opening minutes of How to Build a Planet, which I'm inserting here. So if you've already watched that video and don't want to see this part again, skip to this timestamp. Let's imagine for a moment that we're astrophysicists. For us, order of magnitude estimates are as good as precise answers. We work in natural units, so pi equals 1, and our periodic table looks like this. Hydrogen, helium, and metals. But why? Let's go back to just after the Big Bang, when everything had cooled off enough for all the protons, neutrons, and electrons to form groups. Groups we call atoms. However, at this time, the atoms didn't come in as wide a variety as they do today. No, instead there were only two elements, hydrogen and helium. As time passed, gravity pulled the hydrogen and helium atoms together, closer and closer and closer, until they couldn't possibly take up any less space. And then they fused. 2 atoms became 1, 2 hydrogen atoms became 1 helium atom. 3 atoms became 1. 3 helium atoms became 1 carbon, or 1 metal, as an astrophysicist might say. It didn't end there. It takes a lot less energy to keep a helium atom intact than a hydrogen atom, and a lot less energy to keep a carbon atom intact than a helium atom. That excess energy had to go somewhere. The energy became heat. The heat made the atoms restless, jostling each other aside for more space. The heat fought back against gravity, and gravity pulled back against the heat until they reached a stalemate. A stalemate we call hydrostatic equilibrium, in which gravity and thermal pressure match each other perfectly to create what we call a star. A star that constantly creates more heat and more light only to yield it to the wide, empty universe in every direction. Many billions of years ago, the first of these stars ran out of hydrogen and helium to fuse together. Gravity finally won its war with heat, and the first stars started to collapse. But heat had one last trick up its sleeve. In the smaller stars, as gravity pulled the outer layers in, hydrogen and helium in those layers that had not yet fused did exactly that. Heat was born again and pushed out harder than ever until those once small stars became red giants, slowly shedding their outer layers rich with metals into space, until only a white dwarf remained. In the larger stars, though, gravity's folly was spectacular. Much like the smaller stars, the outer layers collapsed, but there was so much more mass with so much more energy bottled up inside. Those outer layers fell towards the core so fast, until bang! The outer layers collided with the core with such force that they bounced back. Those outer layers exploded into the universe, bringing with them so many metals and creating even more as atoms collided in the catastrophic supernova, leaving a tiny neutron star behind. Now the real story begins. Gravity didn't take its defeat lying down. It grabbed hold of those outer layers and formed them into new stars, and anything that didn't manage to collect into a star became something new. Planets, moons, asteroids, rich in metals and much colder than a star. Cold enough that compounds could start to form. Compounds like dihydrogen monoxide, or as we prefer to call it, water. Too close to a star and water turns to gas. Too far and it freezes solid. Just the right distance and you get liquid water. This distance is known as the Goldilocks zone, and it's where planets lie that might support life. Due to my experience as a storyteller, I was able to produce the narrative structure of that piece instinctively. Every academic can learn to instinctively tell stories in that same way, by considering the values of their audience and spinning a tale of context, character, conflict, and conclusion around them. Prescribing a story a specific structure before you start writing can undermine your purpose and message by ignoring the values of the audience. While describing narrative structures can be useful for analysis, it's best to allow the structure of any new work to emerge as a product of its circumstances. In most cases, assuming you consume stories yourself, you'll find the structure that emerges in your work is one you're familiar with, since you're likely writing for an audience that you or someone you know belongs to. And of course, let's not forget consequences. Always leave your audience with consequences to learn from, like Odysseus, rather than a perfect fantasy to lust over like Agamemnon.